there's this very thin line between a civilian nuclear operation and nuclear armament. How do you effectively uh, monitor if a country is making that transition from point A to point B? And
there is nothing in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that actually stops countries from doing that. Every country has the inalienable right to develop peaceful nuclear energy. Pakistan, for example, followed the both uranium and plutonium for a while. Most countries, once the program has matured a little bit, will move towards a plutonium path because there's less amount of plutonium that is required. You can make somewhat lighter bombs with plutonium cores.
the US and the UK, who were collaborating in the Manhattan Project, it perfectly made sense for US to get it first and then the UK to follow suit.
So the US gets the bomb in 1945. The Soviet Union tests its first bomb in 1949, and then the UK comes in 1952. Even before the US actually even drops the bomb on Japan, the Soviets already know about Trinity. They've started a crash program for their nuclear weapons and they kind of rush towards building the bomb. They find different sources of uranium all across the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union helped set up a lot of the Chinese nuclear industry, even transferred entire ballistic missiles to China in I think it was 1957. Soviets are also an imperialist power. Even if they're socialist, they're still imperialist. Of course, India claims that it is a peaceful nuclear explosion, and the rest of the world doesn't necessarily agree that nuclear weapons does not necessarily stop subconventional attacks. So it cannot stop terrorist attacks, for example. It can't stop drone attacks, as we are learning. It can't stop missile attacks, short-range missile attacks either. And it can't stop cross-border firing from one side to the other.
Our guest today is Professor Devak Das. Professor Das is an assistant professor in peace and security at the Joseph Corville School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He is also an affiliate at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, at the Center de Research International at Sciences Po Paris, and the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, New Delhi. In today's episode, we'll discuss the state of nuclear proliferation in the world today. That's a bite-sized introduction for all of you viewers. Welcome, Devak, to this episode.
Thank you so much for having me, Sanjay.
It's a pleasure. So, I think any discussion about nuclear proliferation all cannot start without one basic question, right? Like, there's this very thin line between a civilian nuclear operation and nuclear armament. And typically, what we notice is anyone who is pursuing nuclear weapons, they get some groundwork done in the guise of civilian nuclear operations for energy purposes, and then they transition to nuclear weapons. So, how do you effectively monitor if a country is making that transition from point A to point B? And it probably makes sense to also double click on the role of the IAEA in the global sphere.
Absolutely. So you're right, Srinjay. There are certain types of civilian nuclear programs that can be turned into nuclear weapons programs. Not all civilian nuclear programs. So we say countries with ENR technology, for example, specific enrichment technology, are the ones that are highest at risk. Now, if you have ENR technology already, then if I'm the IAEA and I'm monitoring what's happening, I would say, well, I want to keep a slightly closer eye on what you're doing. Then there's a question of what levels of enrichment are you at, right? So, for example, you might have an enrichment level of 4.5% or 6%, which is a very low level of enrichment, which you might be using for nuclear energy purposes. Now, for that to become weapons grade, you need to bring that enrichment up to about 90% uranium enrichment. And then you might have a plutonium path as well. That's a separate path. Let's put a pin on that for now. Now, if you do that, going to 90% takes a lot of time, and it's complicated, right? So in that sense, if any country starts building and enriching beyond 20%, for example, then it becomes a big uh, threat for the IAEA. One thing you should remember, though, here is that even if a country does build beyond 20%, there is nothing in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that actually stops countries from doing that, because Article 4 of the NPT basically says that every country has the inalienable right to develop peaceful nuclear energy, right? But it doesn't make a distinction. There's no line drawn ki up till here it's peaceful nuclear energy. At this point, it's nuclear weapons and technology. Anyway, so but yeah, I mean that's a concern that we have today.
Yeah, makes sense. So, like you did mention about two potential paths to developing nuclear weapons. One is plutonium reprocessing. The other would be uranium enrichment. Obviously, these are the two paths that we most commonly hear. Typically, like, has there been a shift from A to B, or do countries typically pursue both in parallel? What the schema looking like in today's world in the past?
Initially, as nuclear programs kind of start, there are many programs that have gone through both paths parallelly, right? So, for example, in the case of the United States, of the two bombs, one each that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one was a uranium core, one was a plutonium core. Pakistan, for example, followed the both uranium and plutonium for a while before they shifted to just plutonium. Most countries, once the program has matured a little bit, will move towards a plutonium path because there's less amount of plutonium that is required. You can make somewhat lighter bombs with plutonium cores.
So now let's probably look at the few case studies, right, to understand how country actually became nuclear power. The first two countries that got the bomb are it's quite common and quite obvious. It's the US and the UK, who were collaborating in the Manhattan Project. It perfectly made sense for US to get it first and then the UK to follow suit. Uh, Maybe let's now focus on Stalin era USSR and how did they get the bomb. I think that's probably the first country that is opposed to the Western Bloc. It's a Warsaw Pact country which got the bomb, and that's effectively what precipitated the Cold War in context.
Right. So the US gets the bomb in 1945. The Soviet Union tests its first bomb in 1949, and then the UK comes in 1952. And there's interesting politics between the US and the UK as well. After 1945, in 1946, the US passes a law called the McMahon Act and says we will not share any of this technology that we've jointly developed, but we won't share it with you to the UK. And so there's very interesting politics happening there. When it comes to the Soviet Union, look, both of these countries are what we would call both the US and the Soviet Union sort of rushed and to the bomb. The US was concerned that it was possible that Nazi Germany might build the bomb, so they ran towards building the bomb. As you might have seen in the movie Oppenheimer, right?
Exactly.
And then there's the Soviets, right? And the Soviets by 1943-44 start getting a hint of the fact that there is some form of nuclear weapons program in the US. Even before the US actually even drops the bomb on Japan, the Soviets already know about Trinity. They've started a crash program for their nuclear weapons and they kind of rush towards building the bomb. They find different sources of uranium all across the Soviet Union. Their scientists are working on it for a while. Of course, once people like Klaus Fuchs sort of bring in, these are people who from the Manhattan Project had stolen some of the technology, some of the blueprints, etc. They bring it back to the Soviet Union, and it helps the Union confirm a lot of things. It makes their program much faster. It wasn't entirely based on stolen material, but the science in itself is difficult but not terribly complicated. So
Right.
so they
Yeah.
got it fairly fast.
Got it very fast. And now that you mentioned Claude Cook, get reminded of all the John Le Carre novels and on all the stories about
Yeah.
Cold War espionage. So he features prominently in many of those stories.
It's interesting you mentioned the John Le Carre novels because it's throughout the 50s and the 60s we've had such interesting, and even today, such interesting sort of interaction between the nuclear world, the nuclear weapons world, and pop culture, right? Just from literature to movies, and of course today, it's with Oppenheimer. There's a sort of emergence of nuclear weapons in the popular sort of imagination.
Next country on the horizon is China, and some even say that probably China's entry into the club is a bigger watershed moment than the USSR's entry in terms of the geopolitical calculus. Maybe we could dump it on China's part to the bomb, and it makes perfect sense, right? Because China did their experiment and they sprint to the bomb on the heels of the Great Leap Forward and the famine and what have you. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, the Chinese bomb is interesting because by China tested the bomb in 1964, and at this point, from the mid 1950s, and perhaps a little earlier than the mid 1950s, the Soviet Union and the Chinese had been collaborating. And the Soviet Union helped set up a lot of the Chinese nuclear industry, even transferred entire ballistic missiles to China in I think it was 1957 and 1957 and 1958. And so that program got a lot of help from the Soviets, but by the time you have the early 60s come around, you're starting to see slowly this break between the Soviet Union and the Chinese, right? Their relationship is not as good. They both want some form of leadership over the communist world. Um, and ultimately, China says, "Look, Soviets are also an imperialist power. Even if they're socialist, they're still imperialist. So we want to build our own bomb." And so it's very interesting because among the states that have gotten very direct technical help on their nuclear weapons programs, China is on the first ones to get that from the Soviets.
Yeah. I had a question here though. Like, typically, if you look at how US works with other like client states in some sense, they would always want to retain a veto power on how far you get ahead in your journey towards nuclearization in some sense, right? What's interesting is the Soviet Union actively transferred technology to China and never actually stopped the Chinese from getting the intel or some of the base technology to make their own spring towards the bomb.
Right. I think there's a line there. I think you're right. But what's interesting is after you shared a certain amount of technical capability, then there's no ability for you to be able to stop the spread of the bomb ultimately, right? So there is a limit there, right? Like, for example, even the Iranian program today, initially when it started off, had the U.S. Atoms for Peace help, right, during the Shah years, when Iran was an ally of the United States. Um, and then, of course, different politics, things change. But some of those nuclear programs were set up by Atoms for Peace and the US as well. So there is, after a certain point, the amount of control that you can sort of exercise becomes considerably less.
Now let's move to the country. Most of our viewers would be interested in India, right? And very interesting journey. You effectively have a gap of 24 years between the first peaceful nuclear explosion and obviously the 1998 Pokhran test. We have sanctions thrown on us, and it's a full journey. Life comes a full circle finally in 2006 with the civil nuclear deal. So maybe let's start from the early years. Right? So uh, Nehru, in some sense, was a very strong votary of disarmament. He was the Bandung conference, and he was one of the chief voices there. And it was very clear that he was against he was against against proliferation, against nuclear technology for warfare, etc. It's only in Indira Gandhi's time when there's this subtle shift happening, and it's almost contemporaneous with Bhutto also traiting towards nuclear armament after the 1971 war. If we could get a sense of how we had the first peaceful nuclear explosion in the 70s.
Right. So it's such an interesting story. You start off, as you said, with even before Nehru, even before independence, you have different labs being set up in Mumbai, Kolkata, and you've got people like Bhabha, S.S. Bhatnagar, Meghnad Shah. So these are folks who are doing nuclear atomic research. And of course, by the time Nehru comes in and independence happens, even in 1948, as our Constituent Assembly debates are happening, Nehru is asked, once the Atomic Energy Commission is set up, is this for building a weapon? Is this for nuclear peaceful purposes? And Nehru says very clearly, despite all his idealistic sort of politics, he says, you know, in a sense, it's for both. We are building it for peaceful purposes right now and for energy, because we think that steam, just like the steam engine propelled the industrial revolution, we think nuclear energy will propel us from being freshly independent, being colonized, and all of that. It will propel us into the new age with technology. That said, we are being very clear-headed, and if the time should come that we need to develop a bomb, no morals would stop us from doing so. And he says that very clearly, right? So he keeps that option open in a sense. There's a great book by Joyita Sharkar called
Yeah.
Plowshares to Swords. It's a Cornell University Press book on India's nuclear program. And she talks a lot about this period and just this idea of just keeping the door open, like keeping your options in front of you, not foreclosing any option. And so even after Nehru, you see Shastri come in. And Shastri is a Gandhian, right? For all practical purposes. He too doesn't close the door on the nuclear program. Things slow down a little bit, but you still have a subterranean nuclear explosion program within BARC, the Bhabha Atomic Research Center.
Yeah.
And so by the time 1974 comes along, you've had the 1971 war. You've had a number of different things come together. One is in 1971, a lot of the Indian establishment was very unhappy with the fact that the United States had sent the USS Enterprise into the Bay of Bengal.
Yeah.
Um, was the USS Enterprise nuclear armed? Potentially. It wasn't clear. But that was something that definitely created some concern. The other thing is, at this point in 1974, you've also got a whole domestic politics issue that Indira Gandhi is facing, right?
Yeah.
So the JP movement is at its height. Railways are being stopped. Telegraph offices, post offices are not working. There's
Yeah.
people are out on the streets. it's very chaotic. Like it's a whole national mass movement. And so there is an impetus there to say, what if we were able to conduct a nuclear test, which we can call a peaceful nuclear test, and it would distract people to some extent. And at the same time, it would affect domestic politics in a way that would help Indira Gandhi. So that's another aspect of the story, right? And then, of course, there's the scientists, right, who are also interested at this point in time. People like Sethna, people like Ramana, who are also very influential and want to test a device. Um, Now, of course, they call it the peaceful nuclear explosion because at the time you had a lot of conversation in the IAEA and internationally about the potential to use nuclear technology and explosions to create dams, to redirect river for developmental purposes, as they would say, as they would call it. Um, and of course, India claims that it is a peaceful nuclear explosion, and the rest of the world doesn't necessarily agree because, it's a capability. Some countries say, well, India can test the nuclear weapon if it wanted to in 2 years, in 4 years, in a very short period of time, basically. And so, hence, the sanctions come, right? And of course, Pakistan at this point is also looking at this, and Bhutto, of course, has made that statement about we will eat grass, but we will build nuclear weapons already after 1971, early 1972. So their nuclear program has been there. It's not that 1974 sparked off the Pakistani nuclear program at all, but it did create a certain amount of
Urgency,
insecurity. Yeah.
insecurity. No.
Yeah.
Just curious, like obviously we have the benefit of hindsight, but back at that point of time, in the early 70s, right? India actually signed a pact with the USSR round about the Bangladesh war. It's not a formal alliance, but it's definitely a friendship pact. Why didn't India choose to pursue a strategy of maybe sheltered pursuit? Basically, the USSR treats India as a client state and helps India spring towards the bomb. What was stopping India from doing that rather than actively hedging in some sense at that point of time? I'm hedging with a civilian nuclear program. I show it's so cloak and daggers. I show that I can test the bomb, but I actually don't have a bomb. You're at that fine threshold. Just curious what leaders then would have thought of.
I think it comes back to a term that we actually talk about a lot now, which was also present then, which is strategic independence. India, even through the non-aligned years, and even though it signed that treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union, still wanted to maintain strategic independence. So this idea that we will be reliant on another country for our strategic weapon systems or for some form of strategic technology was one that didn't sit very easy with the leaders of the day, because again, in 1970, at that point, for example, uh colonialism is not very far away from people's minds. It's just been about 25 years, right? So
And the
even less.
Vietnam War is the very recent memory. It's like not like just two
Vietnam War is
years
still
back.
going on.
Going on.
Exactly. In early 70s went to it's still going on. So this idea of like, do we want to tie ourselves and become fully reliant on the whims of a superpower? I think that has always been an issue within a larger issue within Indian foreign policy, and so you see non-alignment, you see what is a strategic independence, and you see that follow through even in the things that the current government says about Indian foreign policy, right? Like that, we are looking at Indian foreign policy. We don't want to be aligned with another country. In that sense, that's a through line that's actually fairly consistent through the Nehru years, through the Modi years, through sort of Indian foreign policy.
That's a good segue into the next big event in history which probably shaped the trajectory of nuclear armament in the subcontinent. This is the Afghan War, right?
Right.
In
Yeah.
late 70s, you had this fateful event in Pakistan where the US embassy was attacked. Pakistan was on the US's watch list of sorts. But then the Afghan war happened, and Pakistan is the US's strategic ally in the fight against communism. And the US is willing to turn a blind eye, and different administrations, be it the Carter administration or the Reagan administration, they are willing to testify and with again in front of the Congress that the US that the US is not aware of Pakistan testing any nuclear weapons. If you could probably walk us through how A.Q. Khan featured prominently in the period and how Pakistan during the DRDR actively built the first nuclear bomb and something.
Right. So by the time 1979 comes around, India already gets intelligence that Pakistan has been building the bomb, and potentially with Chinese help. The United States also gets similar kinds of intelligence. Um, for the United States, of course, as you say, Pakistan has become such an important geopolitical sort of actor at this point, right? So they basically start giving, because in US law, you have non-proliferation domestic laws as well, and you have to certify that the country that you're giving military aid to is not, in fact, trying to build nuclear weapons. That's the gist of it. It's a very simplistic way to. That's the gist of it. And as you said, they started giving Pakistan the clean chit, right? And that's the context in which today, even today, you hear about Pakistan's F-16s, right? Those F-16s were sold in the early 80s, in 81, 82, right? And that was part of that sort of sale that took place with these clean chits. Rabia Akhtar, who's at the University of Lahore, has a great book called The Blind Eye, where she sort of documents these different Ford, Carter, Reagan, sort of all giving these clean chits to Pakistan, which helped Pakistan build its nuclear program. Of course, at the same time, you've got um, A.Q. Khan, right, who's sort of gone around and, point one, stolen certain centrifuge plans from the Netherlands, and then has come and started to set up a nuclear program. And within that, then you start seeing different pieces of the program being, dual use technology being bought from Europe or being brought from somewhere else. So they're starting to piece together all these different things. And of course, they have help from China, right? So there is various types of suggestions that China has either shared a plan for a nuclear bomb or potentially has helped Pakistan in other ways to build the bomb. So in the mid 1980s. And so and so the program continues, and right after the brass tacks exercise takes place, sometime around 1986, A.Q. Khan tells the Indian journalist Kuldeep Nair that we have the capacity to build the bomb, or we have the bomb already, is what he says to Kuldeep Nair. And that's sort of them starting to signal that yes, we've already got this in the backyard. We haven't tested or anything of that sort, but we have it.
Yep. And I think through the 80s, late 70s, obviously late 70s, early 80s, there's a phase when India kind of loses out because you have a weak coalition government rotating over like series of prime ministers. Indira Gandhi comes in, he's unfortunately assassinated. Rajiv Gandhi comes in, and there's this whole phase where Rajiv Gandhi is actively pursuing a non-proliferation agenda, and that's precisely what he is signaling in the public as well as privately. But I think what changes in the late 80s is this understanding, right? After Operation Backsat, that if Pakistan has the bomb, it's high time we build the bomb ourselves. So I think from Rajiv Gandhi to the Narasimha Rao years, which are fairly important, people actually discount those years because I think most of the groundwork for the Pokhran test was done from 91 to 96. Obviously, Vajpayee built political consensus around the bomb, and Vajpayee was in favor of the bomb even back in the late 70s, right, when he was minister during the Janta Dal. If we could probably walk through those years.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. The Janta Dal, even after 1964, for example, there was a lot of pressure on the Indian government from the opposition, Swatantra Party, and what used to be basically a version of the Janata Dal before it took its form in the 70s, and then the earlier BJP, basically, who all said, we should get the bomb because the Chinese have the bomb. Um, and so there was a strong sort of lobby there, which was lobbying for the bomb. I will say, though, just to clarify, the 80s, yes, you had the transition from Indira Gandhi to Rajiv Gandhi, and then to after Rajiv Gandhi, of course, you have the two coalition governments. That
Right.
said, the 80s, it's not like India was on a back foot when it came to at least nuclear technology. That despite whatever was happening at the center, the work that was being done by the scientists, they were fairly shielded from that. That work was never really stopped by any prime minister, regardless of whether they were coalition or not. So in that sense, there has been a fairly unified sort of policy towards the nuclear program that continued through the 80s and early 90s. Um, Now, as you say, after brass tacks, it becomes clear that it's possible that India is going to have to build the bomb. But what really pushes the decision, and we more or less uh, po- pinpoint the decision to nuclearize, which is to build a nuclear weapon, to Rajiv Gandhi in 1989. And that's because what what happens is India starts getting evidence that at this point China has started, in fact, selling M11 missile, which is a medium range ballistic missile technology to Pakistan. And so there's this concern that Pakistan might actually be able to take the nuclear weapon and be able to put it on a delivery mechanism.
Yeah.
And that becomes then a more immediate sort of threat. Um, and because of that, you see, more or less, I think most historians will agree, 89 is the year that the decision is taken that culminates in eventually Pokhran in 1998. So yeah, so you have basically this concern that Pakistanis might actually nuclearize and be able to have a fully deliverable nuclear weapon soon. And so India starts moving towards different, moving the different, like sort of moving elements of building a bomb together, right? So,
Yeah.
And then of course there's uncertainty. APJ Abdul Kalam, for example, says that as early as 1996, we were prepared to have do a test, and then there's confusion about did the U.S. Intercede in 96 and stop the potential test from taking place in Pokhran. The 13-day government that the BJP had under Vajpayee. There's all sorts of stories, right? Like apparently Vajpayee comes in that 13-day thing and then can't find APJ Abdul Kalam, who's just off somewhere, hanging out, and then he's brought in, and by the time he's told, you should do the test, the government has fallen, right?
Government changes. Yeah, the government.
So there's some of that stuff happening towards, I think once the mid 80s hits, there's all that uncertainty. Then maybe slows down is one way to think about it. But I'm not sure that there is a strong value in India testing any earlier. than it did in 1998.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So around about the same time, you have another big geopolitical event which shapes some of the tensions that still shapes countries from the erstwhile USSR, which is I think the USSR disintegrates and Russia claims itself to be the successor state, and all the nuclear warheads which are basically dispersed across USSR countries.
Yeah.
Russia claims to administer all of those bombs, the weapons, and you have many tensions therein. I think this is something that you're also looking at closely for your book project, or I did you mention this somewhere in an interview about a book recommendation about Kazakhstan? That's what I remember.
Yes.
Yeah, so maybe
Yeah.
if you could walk through this. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the Soviet Union falls dramatically, right? Like at
Yes.
the end of the 80s. And, Russia is the inheritor state, of course. But then you've got these thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons, which are in Kazakhstan, which are in Ukraine, right? Which has become this point of contention today, like
Yes.
which should Ukraine have given up their nuclear weapons? Um, and I have an answer to that, but I'll come to that in a second. And so Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine all inherit these nuclear weapons, and of course for the non-proliferation order, it's like, what do we do now, right? Like, are all these countries going to become nuclear countries? So of course there's a very concerted effort by the United States, the non-proliferation regime, and the Russians help. It is a moment of collaboration where the Russians also want to take those weapons back, not to put them in their own forces, but to dismantle them. And there's at the same time a sort of anti-nuclear sentiment in both Kazakhstan and in Ukraine, because they were not consenting countries that had full buy-in, right? Kazakhstan was being used as a nuclear test site by the Soviet Union, which means that they had a lot of radiation. A lot of people were affected by the nuclear tests, medically, who were around and all of that. So Togjan Casanova has this great book called Atomic Step, STEPPE, and that book really is a fantastic documentation of like how Kazakhstan inherited the bomb and then gave up the bomb. And its experiences through the 50s and 60s with the bomb as well. So that's one really good book around documenting the same kind of story in a very different way. Is Mariana Bugerin's book called Inheriting the Bomb. And that's on the Ukraine story of how Ukraine got the bomb, how there was an anti-nuclear sort of sentiment towards the end of the 1980s in Ukraine as well. And that sentiment then comes together with this idea of, well, can we actually use these weapons? And the answer to that is no, right? Because the command and control system under which the missiles are Soviet. So without those there's no way that you can actually use those weapons. Now, could you potentially have taken the warhead apart from those missiles and then taken the plutonium out? Yes, but that's the most dangerous thing that you can ever think of. Like
Yes.
that's something you should never be trying to do. So the Ukrainians are very clear-headed about that, right? So for them, then the Budapest Memorandum, which at the time seemed like a very good idea, that the Russians, the Brits, and the US come together and say, we will ensure that you will be safe. We are giving you these security guarantees, give up your nuclear weapons. And so the Ukrainians, the Kazakhs, and the Belarusians sort of give up their nuclear weapons, and they also get a lot of financial aid in response. So it's a very fascinating sort of time in terms of countries are giving up nuclear weapons. There's one country we haven't talked about is South Africa, for example, which also had nuclear weapons in the 1980s, and they too give up their nuclear weapons at the turn of that decade, between the 80s and the 90s. So So it's this moment that the nuclear disarmament and the nuclear non-proliferation sort of regime has these big wins, right, as a result of the Soviet Union falling.
Yeah. Coming to the present day, uh, if you have to hazard a guess with Donald Trump not proving to be the most reliable NATO ally, and there's obviously the palpable tension where you cannot actually take the US security guarantees on face value. Would you feel that this is an opportune moment where several countries might want to actually get moves for themselves? Like countries which have actively kept aside and they were relying on US security guarantees all this time? Or like for example, say a South Korea, right? It makes a lot of sense for a South Korea to try to get nuke, especially given that in 2006 we definitively know that North Korea has nuclear weapons. Same goes from for Saudi Arabia, albeit from a different angle. So yeah, if you could probably share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a moment where we're increasingly worried about that. But I will say there are a couple of things to frame these thoughts, right? One is that US security guarantees were always somewhat questionable, right? So, for example, when France leaves the NATO military command in 1966, um, De Gaulle basically says that we are not sure that the United States is going to trade New York for Paris, which is to say that if Paris were attacked, the United States might not get involved, which would lead to a potential attack on New York. Right. So that guarantee was being questioned right through the Cold War, right? Like, would the United States actually step up? So then, we kind of amble on, the Soviet Union falls, etc. So their salience of security guarantees somewhat reduces because Western Europe is no longer under the Soviet threat. But then countries in East Asia, like South Korea and Japan, then become far more reliant on US security guarantees, despite this question mark of like, would the United States actually ever go to war with China over maybe say South Korea or some sort of territorial dispute between Japan and China. Uh, Now, those doubts notwithstanding, there there has been a call, for example, in South Korea for the last decade almost. So that's in that sense, it's not necessarily just a Trump phenomenon. For the almost a decade now, 70% of South Korea's public opinion has been in favor of building nuclear weapons. So that seems like this consistent sort of public opinion trend, right? And that again comes to North Korea. It's this question of if the North Koreans decide to attack, then would the United States step in? And the United States has conventional troop deployments in South Korea and a huge number of troop deployments in South Korea, right? And so I think the answer there, for now at least, is that yes, it would step in. But then there's also a question of like, if North Korea does potentially attack South Korea, if that war sort of resumes, because the last war never really ended, there was
And there, yeah.
just about it, right? Um, if that war resumes, would the North Koreans use nuclear weapons? And I don't know that that's the case. Like, if you're trying to take over a country that you want to be yours, why would you use nuclear weapons and
Right.
like sort of inflict radiation and intergenerational harm and all of those things on the piece of territory that you want to be yours? So there's that broader question as well, right? And I'll just sort of end this set of comments with, there's also a broader question of like, what will nuclear weapons do for you? What can it stop? Right? So you think about India and Pakistan. We got nuclear weapons and we're still fighting wars. Right? You look at what's happening today.
Right.
And so what does that tell us? It tells us that nuclear weapons does not necessarily stop subconventional attacks. So it cannot stop terrorist attacks, for example. It can't stop drone attacks, as we are learning. It can't stop missile attacks, short-range missile attacks either. and it can't stop cross-border firing from one side to the other, right? So if those are all the case, then what now you sort of take those lessons and you apply it to the North Korea, South Korea, or you apply it to Poland, who's talked about getting nuclear weapons because of the Russian threat, right? You put it on the Poland-Russia sort of front.
Even Sweden, for that matter, like who often often in public express regret about the fact that in the 60s they were so close to getting nuclear weapons and they just stopped short. They were just
Right,
at the threshold. Yep.
right, absolutely. And so that the question is, what are you going to do with those weapons? What do you expect that to deter, right? Because we could throw around the term deterrence, it's for deterrence. But what are you trying to deter? Are you trying to deter a conventional attack? You can't. Are you trying to deter a sub-conventional attack where a couple of people come in, like it happened in Crimea, like the little green men come in and take like a piece of land? You can't stop that with nuclear weapons, right? So what is the utility of it? So I think there is the sense that the nuclear weapons are a silver bullet, and right. So we should complicate that thinking with like lessons that we are learning between India and Pakistan today.
Unless you go on Twitter and you see some handles actively calling each government to cross the Rubicon and it's launch nuclear weapons on each other. So if you have madcaps like that, maybe not. But yeah, otherwise, you did mention South Africa, and that's a very, very interesting example because the apartheid South Africa actually got nuclear capability built there in situ, and they did this in hiding in some sense, where it was almost like presenting a fait accompli to the world that yes, I have nuclear weapons, deal with it. But this as a strategy in itself has not been super successful, right? Like for example, Taiwan did not succeed. Uh, Folks like Syria, Iraq. Iraq obviously is a very egregious case because Iraq might have probably succeeded had the Kuwait invasion not happened, and the fact that Saddam was trying to pursue nuclear weapons then was proof enough for the US to still think he possesses weapons of mass destruction, build that narrative, and like basically engineer a coup in Iraq. So, is that strategy even feasible in the near future? Can someone actually get nuclear weapons in hiding?
South Africans were very successful at doing that. Apartheid South Africa, and of course, the one of the reasons that the South Africans gave up the bomb is because apartheid was ending, and they didn't want the successor regime to have nuclear weapons. So, in that sense, racism played a very strong role in them giving up nuclear weapons. It wasn't because they thought nuclear weapons were bad, So we should put that like just front and center. Now that said, your question about can you have a hiding strategy today? I think it's increasingly extremely difficult. Just think of the proliferation of technology, of satellite imagery, right? Like of open source intelligence, even. I'm not talking even the classified technical capabilities of different countries. Just you and I today could be looking at satellite imagery across the world, and we could be tracking certain uh, types of structures that are being built. And so the lens under which anybody might be trying to develop this is now a very magnified sort of lens. And so I think hiding as a strategy is becoming more and more difficult in that sense. And I doubt that you would have too many countries that can have a very successful hiding strategy unless they're being given cover by some sort of patron or the other, right? So here I'm thinking of countries like China or the United States, which might be patron states for their alliance partners or something of that sort, building nuclear weapons.
US
Short
with
of that,
Israel, for example, like basically US with Israel, China with North Korea, classic example. Yep.
absolutely, and US with Pakistan as well, right? Giving that cover, giving that clean chit, kind of telling the rest of the world, no, it's fine. We are keeping track. It's okay.
Makes sense. Uh, I think the last question I had for you is about your book project. So I would like to tell all of you that you have a book forthcoming. When is it due to be published? This year, next year?
We don't have a date yet. I'm hoping sometime next year, but we'll keep our fingers crossed.
If you could probably walk our audiences through what your book intends to cover and how it adds to the literature about the nuclear proliferation and nuclear strategy in general, that would be super awesome.
Absolutely. So the book that I've been working on for a bunch of years now, is a book that really looks at nuclear delivery vehicles. So the idea there is, you build a bomb. Okay, what do you do next?
Yeah.
So do you put the bomb on an aircraft? Do you build ballistic missiles? Do you build short-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, long-range ballistic missiles? Do you build nuclear submarines at all? And we know that different countries have taken different paths when it comes to these sort of things, right? Like the Brits, for example, have just they now have their nuclear weapons just on nuclear submarines. India has a nuclear triad, which means land, air, and sea-based systems, right? France, for example, built a triad and then gave up the land leg of their triad because they said, this isn't terribly useful for us. So different countries take different paths. And so in the book, I'm sort of showing this is how these countries have acquired their nuclear delivery capability. It's a deep historical work. So I've gone to different archives across India, France, the United Kingdom, the US, and sort of brought this like arc of international history to look at same events from different points of view, and draw out this historical story of how these countries have done the acquisition of nuclear delivery vehicles. So that's the book, and I'm hoping that I will have it out soon and everyone can read it.
Have there been accidents due to like basically faulty delivery in some sense? Has that ever happened?
Absolutely.
Okay, that has
Absolutely.
happened.
A lot of the accidents that we've had around nuclear weapon systems have been around nuclear delivery systems. So, for example, Eric Schlosser has this book called Command and Control. And in that book, there is a very detailed account of this Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile, which exploded in Arkansas in the 1980s. And it's this very scary story of a 5 megaton nuclear warhead that was on this missile. And there was a crew that was doing regular maintenance, and this wrench sort of slips out of the hand of the person who was tightening this corkscrew, not corkscrew, a screw, and it falls, and it basically ricochets off the side of the building and hits directly the fuel tank, and there's a huge explosion. And it was essentially very possible that this 5 megaton warhead might have detonated in Arkansas. And
Okay.
it didn't. And that was purely luck. And so, we've had lots of different types of close calls with regard to delivery vehicles as well, right? Like, so in 1983, for example, you have Stanislav Petrov, who is a Soviet colonel, sort of manning the radar stations, and he suddenly sees these 5 or 6 incoming ballistic missiles. The system tells him the United States has launched its missiles towards you, and he looks at that and thinks that can't be right. If the Americans did launch their ballistic missiles, they wouldn't just launch 5 or 6, they would launch all of them if we are at nuclear war. So there has to be some sort of mistake. So he defies protocol. He's supposed to report this to his seniors so the seniors can immediately launch the Soviet nuclear weapons before they get taken out, right?
Yep, yep.
And decides not to do that. And at great personal cost eventually, for not obeying orders. But because he chooses not to do that, they find out eventually, no, it was the rays of the sun uh, sort of reflecting off the radar in a very weird angle, which made it confused and think that, there's some sort of incoming attack. So
Great.
we've had these sort of close calls with ballistic missiles, like a number of times. The United States dropped 2 big thermonuclear weapons on North Carolina. They dropped thermonuclear weapons in Spain, for example, accidentally, like just because a plane either blew up or something went wrong. And so these risks are always sort of around any nuclear weapon complex. So, going back to our earlier conversation, if you decide to build a nuclear weapon, how are you going to ensure that it is safe? Because it's not this country has a bad record or whatever. Every country has had some form of issue or the other, right? It's just that we know about certain cases more than we know about other countries.
Makes sense, I mean, yeah. Can't help but think about Stanley Kubrick and Dr. Strangelove and snafus that can always happen to nuclear weapons. Thank you so much, Devabda. This was amazing. This was indeed a masterclass. Thank you for educating our audiences, and the book references that you have peppered throughout this conversation would be super handy for anyone who wants to pursue this topic in more depth. All the best for your book project. Can't wait to read it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Srinjay. It was a great pleasure to chat with you.